to another episode of the TFR Podcast. We are back today to briefly review the Azerbaijan Grand Prix of 2025 and then look ahead later on to the up-and-coming Singapore Grand Prix this weekend. It is myself, CJH, joined by Patrick today for this pod. How you doing, Patrick? I hope all is well, and are you looking forward to the up-and-coming Singapore Grand Prix this weekend?
Hey CJ, yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I'm just hoping that this Singapore Grand Prix isn't as much of a snooze fest as the one last year,
Yeah.
because there wasn't really a whole lot that happened last season. But I mean, hey, so far 2025 has been the season of banger races, so should be fun.
I don't know. I hope that's sarcasm. I hope, because my word, Singapore and how that was last year with the mix of how 2025 has been, we could be in a bit of trouble here. But who knows? We could be surprised. I remember, a few years back we had the 2023 Singapore Grand Prix, and that season was pretty dull with the whole Red Bull domination. And then we rocked up to Singapore, and all form and everything was just chucked out the window. We had Carlos Sainz winning that for Ferrari in a kind of thrilling finale. So who knows? We could be surprised. And it is such a demanding circuit on the drivers, and some say it is the hardest race of the season to complete, just because of all the factors that goes with it. But we'll get on to Singapore later on. We didn't quite have a podcast out last week, so we better cover some of the things from Azerbaijan. And it was indeed Max Verstappen who won for the second time in a row, and that's obviously now what we now 4 wins for him this season, I believe, off the top of my head. But more importantly, another dominant victory, just like in Monza. He was in untouchable form, and the difference is with this one is it was a bit of a street circuit. It's a bit different to Monza, where we kind of knew the Red Bull has a good low downforce package, but ever since they've brought this floor upgrade at Monza, that car seems untouchable, and even Yuki Tsunoda himself was way further up the order. So Patrick, how much are you looking into this win for Max, and is he sneaking himself back into the title mix here?
I'm hoping that he sneaks back into the title fight so we can have a title fight that isn't ridiculed with just McLaren shenanigans, papaya rules, if you want to throw that terminology in there. But I mean, another thing to note too is that even though yes, Monza and Baku are two completely different styles of track, they're still tracks that favor high speeds. Monza is probably one of the highest speed tracks on the calendar, and Baku, I mean, you have that massive, nearly 2 mile long straight that can give you quite a big boost going down that straight. So those are two pretty high speed tracks. I think Red Bull is on the up, but to say that it's basically the second coming of the RB19 is a pretty big stretch.
Exactly. I think if we see Verstappen dominate, and I say dominate again, in Singapore this weekend, then I'll believe it, because that is a very different circuit to Monza and Baku combined, and it's not necessarily been his and Red Bull's hunting ground over the years. It's the one circuit on the calendar Verstappen has still not won at. So if they can make it free on the bounce this weekend, then I really do think they are starting to somehow bring themselves into play here from absolutely nowhere. But I think with this win for Max at Baku, Patrick, the difference obviously from Monza is he didn't really have his real competitors close with him at the start. We had a very crazy qualifying, probably the craziest qualifying of recent history, you'd go as far to say, because we had so many red flags, so many incidents and crashes, and a little sprinkle of rain in the mix. But with those kind of final runs, almost a bit of a one-shot qualifying, it was Verstappen who made it count and got that key pole, which basically set him up for the win on the Sunday. But he had the two McLarens and others way further back down the order, and that was the difference, wasn't it, compared to Monza? He didn't have any threat from the get-go, and he just controlled the race throughout.
That too. I mean, the McLaren isn't really a straight line speed car. That's another thing we have to consider as well. So at tracks like Monza, like Baku, and like Vegas later on in the season, those are really just not tracks that suit the McLaren, the MCL 39. It is probably the most aerodynamically efficient car on the grid right now. I mean, that's kind of hard to kind of argue because there's a lot of tracks where the McLaren is head and shoulders above anything else. But when it comes to circuits that prefer the higher speed, like your Monza, like your Baku, like I said earlier, like Vegas, towards the final rounds of the season, the McLaren isn't exactly super strong. And even in the race, which I know we'll get to here momentarily, but even in the race, the McLaren's just actually you could even take it a step further and say the entire weekend that McLaren did not look like it was dialed in very much.
And that I think that was the alarming thing is that that's the first time now we've seen McLaren have a real bad weekend. Like they could have sealed the constructors championship, which they'll 99% chance do that in Singapore, but they had an awful weekend in Baku, and I don't know, maybe this is alarm bells for them that maybe they've been caught up a little bit. I mean, they were the clear, second best team at Monza ahead of everyone else, but just really far away from Verstappen. But then they rocked up in Baku, and they were in the mix during the Friday sessions, if you like. They were still at the front, but then it came to qualifying, and just suddenly that pace slipped away. And it was also the mistakes that really cost them. And obviously, the man who had the worst weekend of everyone in Baku was the championship leader, Oscar Piastri. Had two big crashes that could have massive implications on his championship, or it could have, before obviously Norris, let's say, failed to capitalise in the race, which we'll get on to. But firstly, with Piastri, the mistake in qualifying, I think you could maybe kind of let him off with that because it was slippery conditions, and you do see that at Baku. A lot of people already crashed in qualifying. But the start of the race, he had an absolute mare, didn't he? I mean, jumping the lights and then getting kind of passed by everyone as well, just for good measure. And then, yeah, out of pure desperation, kind of at the beginning of Sector 2, Patrick completely binned it in the barriers, and it was game over, wasn't it?
Yeah, I could say that this is easily the worst race weekend Oscar Piastri has had. And honestly, probably almost since he's debuted, really. I mean, the only weekend you could really think of, like across this whole 3 season career, that you could really think what that would be equally as bad was the start of his Formula One career at Bahrain 2023. That was not exactly a good weekend for him either, but this season, that is 100% his worst weekend possible. I mean, and this is a track that it's not like Singapore and Verstappen, where this is a track where Verstappen isn't exactly good at. Piastri won here last year.
He did,
He
yeah.
got his second Formula One victory at this same venue last year after pulling off an amazing move on Charles Leclerc about halfway through the race. So this is a track that Piastri can do good at, but I mean, if anything, it just shows that he is human and he can make mistakes. He's usually pretty cool under pressure, but I mean, you can't really win them all. So yeah, just a really tough weekend there for the Australian.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. We were kind of looking at him almost a little bit robotically, yeah, for a while here. He just did not crack under pressure. He didn't make mistakes. He was the ultimate consistent driver, and I think he was on for the record for the most points scoring finishes in a row. It was like well in the 30s in terms of the amount of races it's been. I think stemming all the way back to Australia last year or the year before even, or something crazy like that. But it's obviously kind of ended that streak, but in a real dramatic way. I think that was what more shocked me, Patrick, is just you wouldn't think that, yeah, with what he's got at stake and the championship lead that he has right now, that he would just make kind of almost a bit of a rookie error, if I could go that far, where you've made a mistake on the opening lap, but then you've got a bit too hot headed and then completely bin the car.
Also, Baku is not an easy track by
Yeah,
any stretch. I mean, if that was him, if that wasn't a street circuit, he might have got away because there might have been a runoff there. But this is a street circuit. The walls are going to be super tight. It's a claustrophobic track already, and trying to get moves done on the circuit isn't exactly super easy either. There's about 2 or 3 key zones that you really want to try to take advantage of. The biggest one being that massive start finish straight, but yeah, I think he's just trying to make a move in the wrong part of the track, and then just kind of. He was probably pretty annoyed because his car went in anti-stall after the jump start, which
yeah,
really threw him to the back of the order anyway. So probably that on top of it just really didn't do him any favors. Really, then obviously we know the rest.
absolutely. And there was almost, you could say, an iconic shot of him sat at the side of the track watching the race on, I think, Marshall's phone whilst it was going on. And I just think it'll be a learning curve for him, but it's not often you see this. It's not often you see this where a championship leader with a good lead as well. You know, he had about 30 odd points over Norris going into this race, and yeah, just opened the door for Norris to capitalise. But the big thing is here, Patrick, Norris was unable to capitalise. Kind of again, starting in qualifying, where those final runs, Norris made a bit of a mistake, clipped the barrier, and then started quite low down. But then in the race, you know, not necessarily his fault, but there was a slow pit stop, which then put him in the pack, and then he was kind of scampering around trying to get back the positions at the end of the race. And like you were saying, Patrick, that McLaren's not very quick in a straight line, so he was almost on for a thankless task, shall I say, of trying to somehow get ahead of the others that were obviously running much lower downforce.
Yeah, indeed, and especially with the fact that the Red Bull that he was pretty much stuck behind through most of that race was on a lower
Yeah,
downforce setup, especially with that new floor that seems to really help them out on top end. Yeah, I mean, it was just really tricky. But even then, there was a lot of periods where he couldn't get past Leclerc for quite a while either.
yeah,
So, and I mean, the Ferrari isn't the quickest car on a straight either, but it's definitely better than a McLaren when it comes to just overall straight line speed. So it just once again, it was just really a track that just did not suit McLaren. And yeah, I mean, this could have been a massive opportunity for Lando to really narrow that points gap down. But he pretty much, even though he did overtake Leclerc eventually, he pretty much just started or finished where he started.
yeah. And in the end, for Norris, he only gained something like 6 points over Piastri, which is obviously less than if he had won the race and Piastri finished second, which is galling, really, if you're Norris, because it's like, this is the big opportunity. I've had the DNF at Zandvoort, which is completely out of my control, but Piastri's had this crash here. You know, it's 3 points up for grabs, but the one time he just could not get just a solid result. He's obviously cut the gap down, but that gap is still fairly big, and he's going to need to keep beating Piastri if he wants to take this championship down to the wire, which it could still happen. But yeah, it's going to be something to keep an eye on this weekend, and depending on where McLaren are in terms of the pace, again, this championship it may be taking another twist just when you think Piastri has got it all under control. A driver who had a quite sensational weekend, we have to say, was a certain Carlos Sainz. Now, he's been having a pretty terrible season. I think it's safe to say, Patrick. It's not been going good at all, this move to Williams. Probably just a bit of teething issues, just whilst he gets used to his new team. But he's been dominated, if you like, by Alex Albon. And there's not been much to shout about at all. But what a way to silence the doubters with I'm pretty sure he went as far as to say that it was one of his best drives of his career to get that podium finish. Obviously, George Russell did pick him off with the overcut, but fair play to Carlos. In that Williams, he may have qualified on the front row, but he had the pace to deserve that podium, didn't he?
And also just historically that Baku is a pretty happy hunting ground for Williams. Their
Mm.
last like full race podium was at that same circuit with Lance Stroll. I mean, another most recent one was Belgium 2021, which I mean
Yeah.
that's
Do we
you
count
can't
that?
honestly you can barely even count that, yeah. But yeah, their last real podium was at this exact circuit, and historically, Williams has always been a car that is good on top end. It's kind of always been the opposite of the McLaren, even going back to the beginning of this regulation cycle. If the Williams was scoring points, it would be at circuits like here. They had a good race last year at Baku, with a double points finish with him and with Albon and Colapinto when that was the lineup for Williams. I mean, they've had good results in Monza. They've had good results in Vegas. And overall, that Williams is a great car for straight line speed. But even then, there's a lot of quicker cars, arguably, that qualified behind him because it was such a jumbled up qualifying. I mean, the Mercedes were quick. They had a really good weekend. Second and fifth, I want to say, I think, or second and fourth was, I
It was
think, the
second and
result.
fourth.
Because Kimi Antonelli actually had a really good weekend as well in that
Mm.
Mercedes. So,
He's
but
close.
yeah, I think Carlos had a fantastic weekend, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you have to feel for Alex Albon slightly because he's been with that team for years now and brought them up, if you like, compared to where he found them, because they were pretty awful not too long ago. But for him to do all of that, Patrick, and then Carlos, who's been having a bad season, is the one to pick up the podium. But then I guess this shows the quality of the driver that Carlos is that despite having a season like he has, when the moment came along, he absolutely delivered.
Yeah, 100%. It reliability has been kind of the name of Carlos's issues. I mean, the only time I could really say Carlos made a mistake throughout the entire season in terms of just in terms of the race was the season opener, which I mean, those conditions were horrendous. I mean, it took out almost a quarter of the field just during the formation lap just because of how slippery it was out in that Melbourne circuit. But yeah, it's just not really been a lot of good luck coming Carlos's way, and it's nothing against Alex Albon because I mean, once again, Alex Albon has pretty much been a real trooper throughout these last few years since he joined this Williams squad. Because I mean, that Williams car, I mean, they were running off Excel spreadsheets. Granted, I when I went to college, I'd use a lot of Excel spreadsheets, but using Excel for college assignments versus a fully fledged multi-million dollar Formula One team
That's
isn't
right.
exactly ideal. But
No.
another thing too is that considering that, I mean, Baku was a real mess for Albon. There's no beating around the bush there. It was just not his weekend. But considering the rest of his season, I mean, it's a really good advertising for Atlassian, which is a management software type.
Yeah.
So I mean, as soon as they switch from Excel to Jira, I mean, they've just done a lot better, I think. And
Yeah.
also, like you said, Alex has brought them up, Carlos has brought them up, and overall, I think this is a really solid driver lineup. And I think 2026 is going to be a really good year for Williams.
Yeah. And this is what they've almost deserved for the last couple of years of the growth under leadership of James Vowles as well. They just seem to be on a positive projection all the time, and that's why I still think it's a good move for Carlos to go to Williams before even this podium at Baku because that team is going in the right direction. They are getting better and better,
Oh
and they're
yeah.
the lead team in the midfield now, quite comfortably, I'd say. And I think, yeah, I agree with you, Patrick. I'm intrigued to see where they go. Will they break into that top end of the field? And could this maybe be the first of many podiums to come? You know, because we've seen this before. We have seen, if you go back like 10 years, at the beginning of the hybrid era, the Williams was pretty good. You know, they had pole positions, they had multiple podiums with Bottas and Massa and drivers like that. But it was kind of probably that season after Stroll got the podium at Baku 2017 and then onwards, they seemed to nosedive in the performance and just the whole seriousness of the whole team. But they have really came back now, and I think yeah, everyone can absolutely admit that we're glad to see Williams are on the up, and what a result for Carlos Sainz as well, because I think everyone knows he's better than what we've seen this season, and he well and
Right.
truly delivered that. But you mentioned there Mercedes. I thought George Russell had a great drive, Patrick, because it went a bit under the radar. His season's kind of been under the radar in general, to be honest, because it's
Right.
not exactly been massive talking points apart from his win in Montreal. But again, this was just a really well executed drive when, they were maybe a little bit further back than they wanted to be in qualifying, but he did a good strategy, and with the pure pace that they had, Mercedes can be pleased with that, can't they?
And not to mention that George Russell was under the weather the entire week.
Of
He
course,
missed
yeah.
out media day, and I mean, he had respiratory infection, which I mean, even for you and I, just people who are on the podcast and commentate, a respiratory infection is rough. Let alone driving a Formula One car going through 5 to 6 Gs pretty consistently through Baku and still pulling out a podium. And I mean, granted, I'm not a George Russell fan by any stretch of the imagination, but after that performance in Baku, how he doesn't have like a full contract yet for 2026 and beyond is just baffling to me.
Well, I think the thing is, Patrick, there's this sticking point with him and Mercedes at the minute where Mercedes know that they're probably going to be quite good from next year onwards. So they've got that pulling power of they can really choose whoever they want, and Verstappen could become available after next year. So they want George on a 1 year contract. Not necessarily because George is a bad driver, but they just want that option of flexibility where they can pick and choose who they want there. But obviously, if you're George Russell, you absolutely don't want that. You want as long as a contract you can get at a team that you're pretty confident is going to be near the top end of the field. And so, what are Mercedes going to do? If George didn't sign a contract for next year, he'd be screwed. But then so would Mercedes, because there's no other driver for Mercedes to somehow, pluck out of thin air. So it's some bizarre scenario there, isn't it? Where it's reached a bit of a roadblock of nobody's budging. But which side do you kind of see it better from here? Do you lean more towards George's perspective, where it's like he's doing the right thing, standing his ground here? Or do you think Mercedes are playing this well by kind of sticking to their guns?
I'm more on George Russell's side on this because pretty much the only other like good driver that you could say is even like in a similar ballpark to how George Russell or how good George Russell is was Pierre Gasly, but now he just recently signed a multi-year extension with Alpine. So really, and you don't have Bottas anymore because he's going to Cadillac. That deal's already signed and done. So you really just don't have any other options aside from getting a reserve driver from one of the other teams, or and even then, their only actual reserve driver that they have it would be a rookie. So you'd have
Yeah.
Antonelli as like the senior driver on his second year in Formula One, and then the only option I think they have is Frederick Vesti, which Frederick is a good driver, but I mean, just with all due respect to Frederick Vesti, I do think he's a good driver. He's done good in IMSA, he's done good in endurance racing, but you're not going to get the same results out of Frederick as you would out of George Russell. That's just, I just think it's kind of silly for Mercedes. I mean, I understand that they want that flexibility. They want Verstappen, or even the rumors of 2027 Charles Leclerc potentially jumping over.
Yeah, I've
I know
seen
those
that.
have been pretty solid rumors. But even then again, like before you get to 2027, before you get to that window when Charles Leclerc or Max Verstappen might be available, you got to get through 2026. So I mean, for obvious reasons, Russell wants stability because everybody right now, at any of these top teams, the only seat that could be available would be Red Bull, which I don't know if that'd be the best environment for Russell because him and Verstappen haven't always got along, and certainly for 2026, they are not gonna drop. I mean, he's pretty much locked into that team. I think even his contract's till 2028.
Yeah, and I just don't see Russell as a Red Bull man. He just doesn't
Me
strike
neither.
that kind of driver. And I feel Red Bull, you know, I mean, I could see Red Bull down the line going in all in, shall I say, if Verstappen left on a driver like Piastri, because I don't think all is perfect with McLaren and Piastri with the whole way Norris is kind of seen there at the team. I don't think there's issues there, but I think there's the potential that that could get worse. over the next couple of years or whatever. And so then, if I could see anyone that Red Bull would target, would be Piastri, because also there's the Weber connection there of Red Bull from the
Hmm.
past as well, and they could just put all their eggs in one basket for him, and he probably wouldn't mind that if the car is obviously competitive. So then I could maybe see Russell going to a McLaren or someone like that. He could suit that kind of team quite well. But I think just in general, Mercedes should need to get Russell signed up. Just accept it for 2 years. You've got Russell, who's pretty much not far off his prime of his career right now. You know, he's in really good form and having one of his best seasons to date. And I just think, Antonelli is still way off it. He's way off it in terms of leading a team and being
Oh
championship
yeah, 100%.
contending, miles off. So just keep with the consistency of George and quit mucking around here. I think they will eventually get this signed, Patrick. I think that'd be a massive bombshell if somehow this didn't get signed. Um, but as we get closer to the end of the season, you kind of wonder when's it going to happen. So we shall see. I think the only other person I want to give a bit of a shout out from Baku was Liam Lawson, actually. And I thought he had a really, really good weekend. And he was almost a bit unfortunate because so many other drivers had good weekends or bad weekends. It was not necessarily a massive talking point. But he had a great qualifying in third place. And I was delighted to see that, actually, that he was kind of in those post-quality media interviews because he had such a rough start to the season and then really defended well in the race to get a fifth place finish and another great result for RB this season. What was your thoughts on his weekend?
I think Lawson is really making a strong case for himself because, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, but especially in the last 2 days, there's been a lot of rumors saying that Arvid Lindblad is going to get promoted to one of those Racing Bull seats.
Yeah,
So now and then a lot of rumors of Isaac Hadjar getting promoted or demoted, depending on how you want to look at it, to the second Red Bull seat. And then now it's just pretty much like you have 4 seats for the Red Bull fold, and then you got 5 drivers wanting those seats. So you got to really think, is it going to be? And I think Lawson is making a really good case. I mean, like you said, his start of the season was pretty bad, honestly. Even people are saying that he might get sacked mid-season overall. But we have to remember, Liam Lawson does have a lot of pace. He was good at Super Formula before he joined F1. And actually, a thing that I don't think people really remember super well is even in the dominance of Max Verstappen in that Red Bull RB19, Liam Lawson out qualified him at Singapore 2 years ago,
he
knocked
did.
him out, put him into Q2. So, and even when he did jump back in after Singapore, I mean, Liam Lawson has a pretty solid result. So, I think Liam Lawson's really getting back into the swing of things. And I honestly think that I'm not expecting a podium from Liam throughout the season, but I don't think we're going to see many other bad weekends from the Kiwi.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic there, actually, Patrick. Is who's going to get that last RB seat? Because I think we're pretty certain to say now Isaac Hadjar is going to go to that second Red Bull seat, we believe. I think that's quite likely in terms of the rumours that are going around for next season, bearing in mind. But then it's who is in that RB lineup. Is Yuki Tsunoda going to go back there, or is he going to get booted out completely? Is Liam Lawson going to maintain his seat there, or is he going to get booted out? And then obviously with Lindblad coming through, is he ready yet for that spot? What if you were to make a prediction? What is that VCARB lineup looking like for next year?
Honestly, in terms of prediction, I think it is probably going to be Lindblad and Lawson. I would say, just because I
Wow.
mean,
Okay.
he's been at that Racing Bulls team for eons.
Yeah.
So, and also they don't have that Honda connection anymore, which I know Honda doesn't really like. They'll still be a sponsor for Yuki, but they're not a massive driving force anymore for Yuki because Red Bull is switching to working with Ford for the next regulation cycle. But I mean, Yuki, he's really. If you want to quantify like how good Liam has done in Racing Bulls compared to Sonoda in that Red Bull, I think Liam has had a better uptick in form because even then, even though this was Sonoda's best week of the entire season in that Red Bull. Lawson still beat him.
He did, yeah. He did.
So, I mean, in my opinion, I think Red Bull should keep its current lineups just for some stability going into its regulation cycle. Because personally, I agree that Lindblad is quick, but I don't think he's really ready yet. I think he could take another season. And then there's also the rumors of Alex Dunn potentially being a possible
Yeah.
target driver, the McLaren Junior for that second RBC. And he at least Alex Dunn he's close to lead for that F2 title, but I mean honestly, the whole F2 scene could be its own podcast, honestly, so I won't spend any more
Yeah.
time talking about it.
But I think this is the point, is there's some drivers where they may just need that one more season just to be absolutely sure. To be honest, I think Antonelli probably needed another season in F2 just to get himself properly settled there. And obviously, if Mercedes didn't have the situation of they needed a driver right there and then, maybe it'd been different. But I think for RB, they're obviously saying Lindblad's going to be this next top talent, coming through the pool. And yeah, I would say it's making that decision of you either be patient and you give him one more year, don't make that mistake of rushing too quickly and then, driver gets burnt out. Or you have to just cut ties with Yuki and just say thank you for your time here, but it's just not quite worked out, to the potential of other people. Because I think the thing with Liam Lawson is, how he's bounced back. He's had such a bad start to the season and had, really looking doom and gloom. But for him to bounce back and has actually been better than Haja for quite a few rounds recently, that takes some going. So it's on a knife edge, Patrick. I think these last few races of the season are
Oh yeah.
critical races for those pool of drivers, and that's another kind of thing that I'm sure we'll come back to on future podcasts. But I think that's pretty much Baku wrapped up. Some of the other results were a little bit kind of mediocre. There was quite a few teams that were distant from the points, actually, because you had like Colapinto as a bit of a cork in the bottle for part of the first half of the race, which then created this big gap from the points to then everyone else. So it was not, I wouldn't actually say it was the most exciting race we've seen this season, but it was more the result itself was obviously very exciting and great to see, a kind of mixed up thing. And we're kind of hoping for a bit more of that this weekend in Singapore. Now, there are rumours there's a bit of stormy weather around in Singapore for this weekend's race, which is never far away. If anyone's ever looked at what Singapore is like in terms of weather, they seem to have thunderstorms all year round. But we've obviously had maybe a couple of wet races here over the years. Most notably, I want to say, was that 2017, I want to say, when the Ferraris crashed into the first corner, I think it was, yeah. And then we had 2022, I think, was that race that Perez won. But so who knows? We could have a bit of rain this weekend. Just throw another bit of chaos into the mix, Patrick, which I'm sure you wouldn't mind.
Oh, 100%. And I think that would also kind of shake things up a bit because I mean, we know Verstappen is ridiculously good in the rain. If you don't count Singapore not Singapore, Silverstone this year, we had a bit of a spin, but even then, I mean, Verstappen is really good in the rain, but this is also the only track on this current calendar that he's never won at. So I think that's gonna really spice things up a bit as well.
He'll be desperate as well, won't he? He'll be desperate to kind of shake off that one race that he's not won. Because also, he is in supreme form at the minute. Obviously the car has been a lot better, but like his whole win at the Nürburgring last weekend, for those who missed this, obviously he dived into the GT. Was that 4-hour endurance race or 6-hour endurance race, something like that?
It was a 4-hour race, yeah, at the Nürburgring, the NLS.
That was the one, and
Yep.
yeah, rocked up and pretty much dominated it, and he's just I know he's done a bit of practice for that, but that just kind of shows the frame of mind that Verstappen's in at the minute. Is that he can just go and do that and just wipe the floor clean. With a lot of drivers that do that as a full time series, and that's their bread and butter, if you like. So I think Verstappen is in the right form at the minute to pull off something quite sensational. And I can't wait for qualifying, to be honest, Patrick, because that dictates a lot of how it's all going to unfold this weekend. But what's your thoughts on this track in terms of the challenge that it brings? I'd like to kind of discuss this a little bit because we've seen this over the many years where the drivers say this is the toughest circuit on the calendar, and it has had a slight tweak in the layout in the last few years. We've obviously lost a few of the corners towards the end of the lap where they're a little bit Mickey Mouse, let's say, they're kind of left and a right and a right again. It's a bit more straight line, and that probably gives the drivers a little bit more of a breather. But I don't know if you ever saw the Drive to Survive from last year, but George Russell suffered quite badly from this race last year from dehydration and just the toll that it put on his body, and really was in a pretty distressed kind of state. And what's your thoughts on this kind of track? Is this the hardest circuit of the season? It is the longest, obviously, but do you kind of go with that logic?
If we're just taking it to just the regular track layout itself, I don't think it's the hardest track on the calendar.
Really?
It's the outside elements like the heat, like the humidity that does make this the toughest race of the season. But that's not to say that it's an easy track either, because like we've seen both from the TFR eSports that ran at Singapore a few weeks ago, it is a very narrow track. It can bite you. I mean, the walls are closed. I mean, even though Lando Norris dominated this race last season, he almost hit quite a few walls, just even though he had zero pressure on him whatsoever. Singapore is just not an easy track. I think it's better that they got rid of those Mickey Mouse corners, as you call them, but still doesn't make this track that much easier. It's a hard layout because it's a street circuit. And then you throw on the outside factors of that humidity, of just the heat in Singapore.
Mm.
And yeah, I would say it's the hardest race of the season by far.
Yeah, I think as well the flow of the lap is a lot better now. Now we've lost those other corners, because I always used to think like you'd get to that part of the lap and then it all just slows down a little bit, and it's just a bit of an underwhelming, sorry, end to the lap where the rest of it is pretty high speed actually. Especially I'm old enough to remember when they had the Singapore sling in the middle sector where you had those almighty curbs that many cars seem to bounce over, and just little corners like that. It just unnecessarily slowed it down. When now, yeah, it's actually quite a high speed circuit, which again could favour Red Bull and Verstappen this weekend potentially. Um, but I mean, yeah, I think you're right. It's the other conditions that makes it difficult. There's not necessarily a difficult corner at this track, but it's just more the unrelenting nature of it. And I think a qualifying lap, I think, is one of the best to watch of the season. I don't know if you've seen the clips of the Hamilton lap. I think again from 2018 or something like that, when he took pole by like a second or something. And actually, just watching those kind of hot laps are just insane. Like, you don't really get that same feeling with other circuits where it's so close to the barriers and the kind of whole night spectacle. But in terms of previous races here, Patrick, we've obviously had quite a lot of controversy here. And a certain Flavio Briatore is obviously returning to this circuit where he is almost most known for his Crashgate scandal back in 2008. And I find that crazy that that was a good year until that really kind of came under the spotlight, if you like, in terms of people really showing what happened. And obviously, I think it was Nelson Piquet Jr. that really kind of exposed what happened. But it's crazy, isn't it, that Flavio is coming back to this race this weekend as the team principal of that very team.
It's gonna be a weird weekend, I think, in terms just for Alpine in general, just because of that aforementioned history. The last time Briatore was at the circuit, it was Crashgate, and with this exact team, like you mentioned. So it's gonna be a weird one, and also consider that Alpine is having a very tough season.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, I really am not saying that this is going to be a good week for Alpine, but hey, who knows? We were kind of everybody was kind of collectively saying that for Brazil, and then look what happened due to some outside shenanigans.
I'm telling you, Patrick, if I see Colapinto crash in the opening stages of the Singapore GP and Pierre Gasly has gone on some crazy strategy, we may be having Crashgate Part 2 here. But we'll hopefully not have that happen. I'd be very shocked if it does. Right, let's get into some predictions then. We've gone on a decent streak actually last few rounds because obviously Verstappen has been getting pole position quite a few times. So let's see if we can predict the Singapore Grand Prix correctly this week. So Patrick, I'll let you get us started then with your pole position prediction for the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix.
That is, I'm gonna actually have two different answers. One for the dry and one for the wet.
Oh wow.
I think if it's a dry qualifying, I'm gonna say it's probably gonna be Lando Norris because Lando Norris has had a pretty good record around this track. I mean, even though he had a lot of unnecessary near misses here last season, he did dominate this race, and this is certainly a happy hunting ground for him, I would say. If it is wet, I am actually gonna go with Max Verstappen because Max is probably one of, if not the best wet driver on the grid right now.
Okay, okay. I'm actually going to go with Max for pole anyway. I am well and truly on this hype train at the minute of Verstappen going for that fifth title. And I think he is going to pull something out of the bag like he's done at Japan, like he's done at Saudi this season. And he's going to nick pole position um, from nowhere, really. So I think Max can do it. But how's your podium looking? Because this could be maybe a different story.
So if it is, I'm just gonna say if it is dry,
Mm-hmm.
my prediction is I'm gonna say it's gonna be first. Actually, in both conditions, I would say Verstappen is gonna win this.
Okay.
Um, Bit of hopium, but I think it's gonna be more pace based in if it's a wet, but if it's dry, I just have that sneaking suspicion that Lando is gonna lead for a good chunk of this race, but then he's gonna have a slow pit
Mm.
stop like that's been plaguing him for the last several rounds in a row. So I think if in the dry, I'm gonna go with Max, Piastri, then Norris,
Okay.
and then
Max,
I did do,
Piastri, and
and
Norris.
then
Yeah.
if we're in the wet, I think Norris and Piastri will swap. Or
Okay.
sorry, I mean Norris and Piastri. Not sure what I actually said, but I think Norris and Piastri will swap. It'll be Norris second and then Piastri third because I mean, I prefer Oscar Piastri, but I think Lando generally is just a bit better in the wet.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if that kind of race happened, then again that would benefit Norris, um, in terms of pure performance, and also Piastri didn't do too great at this track last season anyway, considering how well Norris did. So, yeah, I can kind of see that theory there. I think that if we do get rain on the Sunday, we could have a bit of a mixed up kind of result, like we've seen in the past before, because I do think that this track, it just kind of, once one thing happens, it breeds more chaos to happen. A little bit like Baku in some sense, but in different ways. Um, I think in third, I'm going with. Oh, I'm going to go with Russell third, and then I think Norris will be second. I really probably come across as a Piastri hater at the minute, which I'm genuinely not, but I do think he's just probably going to be about fourth for Singapore because the McLaren could get picked off. And then, you guessed it, Patrick, Max Verstappen is going to win the Singapore Grand Prix, in my opinion, and make it 3 wins in a row. So, again, do you think if Max wins this weekend, championship is on, or is it still needing a bit more to get that bit closer?
I I think if Singapore goes Max's way, then yes, I think we're totally on because this is the only circuit that is really kind of a question mark for Max because he's never really done super well here. He's led 3 laps period at the circuit, which is less than a Sauber with Antonio Giovinazzi. He's led 4 laps around the circuit, so it's not particularly a happy hunting ground for Max. Knocked down in Q2 in 2023 when he had the most dominant car on the grid by like a country mile. He did have a pretty solid race last year, though. He got second, but still 25 seconds or so off of Lando Norris. So I think this is definitely the biggest question mark track. I mean, he's won at pretty much every other track on this calendar. So, and most tracks are really going to start to favor the Red Bull because out of the remaining races, the only track I could see that really does benefit the McLaren outside of Singapore would be Coda. I think Coda would be the only other track where McLaren should have a really good advantage. Because Vegas is probably going to go Red Bull's way. Qatar is been known as a pretty happy hunting ground for Red Bull as well, with Red Bull winning a majority of the races at that circuit. And Abu Dhabi could really go either way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, Mercedes will be really quick at Vegas again as well, because that's obviously going to be cooler temperatures. So I really think this is a really important weekend for Norris and Piastri, because for their championship, in terms of gaining a big points haul over the other, it could be quite key. Because like you say, Patrick, apart from probably COTA, other circuits we're not expecting the same kind of McLaren domination, because Mexico, Verstappen is pretty unstoppable there for most seasons if the car is within a chance of winning. And Brazil, we saw what happened there last year. There could be all sorts of chaos to come, and I think McLaren have gone through a patch of dominating everybody, but Verstappen is here in the mix, and I can't wait for this weekend, because it's going to basically give us the answer to a lot of things. Because if Verstappen's nowhere near pole, then we can all calm down here, and it's like, well, it's just back to what we had, Piastri against Norris, and we'll see how that ends up. However, if Verstappen can win this weekend, oh boy, we have got an unbelievable end to the season in store, because there could just be so many more complications added into the mix. I think we'll call it at that, though, for this week's podcast. We'll see how right and how wrong we'll be with those predictions, but we're on a decent streak. I've got confidence in it, Patrick. We're going to nail it this time around. Thank you, though, for this week, Patrick, joining me on the podcast. Been a pleasure as always. And we'll be back next week to review the Singapore Grand Prix. And then I believe, we'll be looking ahead to the US Grand Prix in COTA, which always feels strange that suddenly comes around straight after Singapore. But we're reaching the end of the season, and this could be a very important race this weekend for the championship. If you've enjoyed this podcast and you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Every sub is much appreciated, and if you're listening on your audio platform of choice, make sure to give us a follow. We'll see if Verstappen can win this weekend. We'll see you in the next one.